I think it's obvious to everybody here that if that is your framework for Asia, India is kind of over here on the outside. The idea of the Indo-Pacific framework incorporates India into that larger map. So it places India in a much more regionally strategic and central position. The way the Trump administration has defined the Indo-Pacific so far, at least the definition that appears in the national security strategy, runs from essentially California to Mumbai, sort of the west coast of the United States to India's west coast. So what we're missing between these two different visions of the Indo-Pacific map is this huge space of the Indian Ocean that lies between India and East Africa. In foreign policy, it has often been hard for India to rise to the top of the radar screen. Why? Because it's not a crisis. India is not North Korea. There is no crisis unfolding on a daily basis through which the National Security Council needs to schedule different meetings to figure out what to do. Rather, the U.S.-India relationship and U.S. strategy for our relationship with India is really a long-term strategic look. And so that's not always the thing that gets on your front pages or rises to the top of the radar screen. So placing India in a more central geographic location by expanding that framework of the geography is actually very helpful to elevating India's importance to U.S. long-term strategy. The Trump administration has also imposed higher tariffs on steel and aluminum products coming into the United States. It turns out this is important for India, too. This is not an India-specific economic initiative, but India is caught up in that same net. So I would argue that on the economic side, things are a little bit different than they were in the past because we've added to the laundry list of frictions that already exist and made that list longer.
And so India today is the sixth largest economy. In 2017, it was the sixth largest economy. By IMF projections, 2022, it would cross Germany and be the fourth largest. Reasonable likelihood by 2025, it will be pretty much equal to Japan's, might be a little bit behind, a little bit ahead, and so on. And so by 2026, it should be the third largest after US, China, and India. And actually, it will be closing the gap with China as China closes the gap with the US. So what does that mean? Is that already just based on IMF projections is that, first looking at last year, China's GDP was 5 times that of India. 2025, it will be 4.5 times. 2030, it will be 4 times. If we project out, assuming India grows at 8 and China at 5, many people would say China probably slower than 5. And India, I'm not assuming 9 or 10, just 8, which seems reasonable. 2040, India could be only 1/3 that of China. So essentially, that when Chinese companies look outside China, India is, and obviously, you don't make investments, looking at next year in mind. You look at the next 10 years in mind, that they are looking at India as one of the 2 largest economies after the US, okay? And the fastest growing economy. So even if, let's say, you think of China as the best and brightest in the world, but if you're looking outside China, really India becomes mission critical.
India has always been, and will continue to be, an independent foreign policy actor in the world. So India does not necessarily want to get too close to the U.S. For many reasons. So China is not so much worried about that, as opposed to Japan, Australia, who are traditional allies of the U.S. So they have. And China also believes that India needs China, and China needs India as well. So there are many tools that the Chinese leadership can employ to basically woo India closer to China. So they're not so worried about this, sort of India-U.S. Alliance, targeting China. It's not there yet, at least not in the near future. Whether they would be embracing that strategy also, I think, depends on how India thinks about this issue. If India makes India-Pacific strategy, from India's perspective, of course, more inclusive one, a more open one. And then, there are things that I think China and India can work together. One recent example is, as we see from the Wuhan meeting, of course, depends on how the implementation would go. But, India and China are talking about a joint economic, project in Afghanistan. Would have thought that, before the war. I mean, that's not,
The China-Pakistan relationship didn't begin 3 years ago. The announcement of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has both accelerated and increased the types of investments in infrastructure that China is making in Pakistan. But in many ways, you could argue that the Karakoram Highway, what begun in 1958 or 59, completed in the mid-70s or so, this was a precursor to the Belt and Road vision. This was decades ago. The port of Hambantota was actually not a Belt and Road project. This was begun in the early part of the 2000s, I think. An agreement that came to pass because Hambantota was the hometown of Sri Lanka's former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa. Part of the problem with that project is that it was built to satisfy a political desire, and it was a totally uneconomic project. There are no container ships that go to Hambantota. Nobody goes to that airport in Hambantota. The reason that Sri Lanka was unable to pay back the interest on the loan for building these projects was because they, A, had been negotiated with no transparency and secret. Nobody knew the terms of this investment. B, there was no sustainability or economic viability study for these projects done in advance. So I say this by way of setting the context. These projects actually predated everything that has been happening with the development of an official Belt and Road initiative that is the official policy of China.
So I don't think in terms of on the economic factors, I don't see serious risks. The real risks that I see are geopolitical. And of course, are the risks of a war between US and China zero? No, they are non-zero. They are low, but they are non-zero. The risks of a war between China and Japan are non-zero. And if those were, the risks of a war between China and India are non-zero on the border issue, if you just look at, the recent few years. And of course, if the US and China were to stumble into a war, or of course, if Japan-China very quickly will become US-Japan-China, it's hard to imagine India not getting sucked into that. Okay, so India would, in a sense, be asked to choose a side, and it would be hard for India at that point to stay neutral. So I think those risks are non-zero. But I see those risks as not really just for India, because those are global events. Can we imagine Europe just staying on the side, part of NATO and Russia? So I think those are so I don't see regional risks so much as I see these kind of global risks.
Most people in China, in the policy intellectual circles, until very recently, they couldn't care two hoots about India. Small countries obsess over large countries don't obsess over smaller powers. That's always the case. It's only very recently that this has begun to change, partly as India is, as for all the reasons the panelists have said. But also, part of the thing is to think longer term. It's only in the last decade that India has begun to seriously move closer, to the United States. And the real target for China is the US. It's not really India. And so this is as much as a warning to India about what China can do if it comes too close to the US. And in counter, India is also sending a signal to China that if China continues to do this, it'll get closer to the US. So it's a chess game where each is signaling to the other what it can do. But until very recently, most Chinese scholars or policymakers, India was a fly to be swatted. It wasn't something they really thought about. Yes, but that has begun to change.